John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism is a classic defence of utilitarian ethics, published between 1861 and 1863. Mill sought to popularise and defend the modern utilitarianism that his teacher, Jeremy Bentham, had founded. Utilitarians maintain that you can judge whether an action is morally right or wrong by the amount of net pleasure or pain it produces. Mill says that all action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action, it seems natural to suppose, must take their whole character and colour from the end to which they are subservient. To understand what we should do morally, we should know how to judge our actions, and Mill says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Mill spends a lot of the book defending utilitarianism against the claim that it is wrong to reduce all ethical problems to the question of pleasure. Before Mill, Bentham believed that pleasure could be quantified mathematically, so that moral judgments could be made based on how much pleasure or pain an act would produce. He formulated the felicific calculus, or hedonistic calculus. The amount of pleasure derived from an act could be measured by variables like intensity, duration, certainty of the pleasure happening, propinquity, or how far away that pleasure will be, fecundity, the probability of more pleasure of the same kind, purity, the guarantee that ill effects won't be felt, and extent, or the amount of people that will be affected. Bentham thought that policymakers could legislate according to how much societal pleasure would be produced, but he was criticised for reducing human experience to simple pleasures. His critics called utilitarianism a pig philosophy, suggesting that Bentham's logic predicts that people would sit around eating or chasing base pleasures all day. The problem was that Bentham had said that quantity of pleasure being equal, Pushpin, a popular children's game at the time, is as good as poetry. The contemporary philosopher Roger Crisp gives the example of Haydn and the oyster to illustrate the problem. In Crisp's story, you're a soul in heaven before you're born, waiting to be allocated a life. The angel says that you can be the great, cheerful and popular composer Joseph Haydn, or an oyster that experiences mild pleasure, like floating in a warm bath. You choose Haydn, and the angel sighs, bemoaning that he'll never get rid of the oyster. Look, he says, I'll offer you a deal. Haydn will die at 77, but the oyster will live as long as you want. This poses a problem for the utilitarian. No matter how much pleasure is derived from being Joseph Haydn, if the oyster lives forever, at some point the amount of pleasure it has experienced will have surpassed that of Haydn, yet almost all would still choose the life of Haydn. Mill's answer to the problem is that some pleasures are intrinsically more valuable than others, and that once we are aware of certain higher pleasures, we won't be happy to leave them uncultivated. He wrote that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied, and if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is only because they only know their own side of the question. Characteristically, Mill then lays out a principle to differentiate between higher and lower pleasures. A pleasure is a higher pleasure if it would be chosen over another pleasure, even if it was accompanied by discomfort, and if it would not be traded with a higher quantity of the other pleasure. Mill says that it is an unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human creatures would consent to being changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to being a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than they are with theirs. Some pleasures, Mill said, are incomparable, but critics said that some people choose lower over higher pleasures, or give up certain pleasures altogether. To this, Mill says that yes, some people, like ascetics, will give up a life of happiness willingly, but that they do this for a greater end, the happiness of others or God. So utilitarianism is a moral standard for judging the happiness of all people, not just each single person. Mill argues that people do desire things like virtue as well as happiness, but that virtue is a part of the abstract whole of happiness. Mill's utilitarianism has been criticised for being elitist. Who's to say I wouldn't choose a life of endless chocolate cake over a life of being Joseph Haydn? And utilitarianism in general has been criticised as justifying the murder of one person if it maintained the happiness of two. But Mill would say that utilitarianism is more subtle than that. A society that isn't sure whether one of its members could be murdered at any time by the government just for the sake of another's happiness would surely be a less happy society than the one where everyone is protected. Ursula K. Le Guin's short story, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, depicts a city where everyone is happy, healthy, and rich. She asks the reader to imagine their own perfect city. Omelas sounds, in my words, like a city in a fairy tale, long ago and far away, once upon a time. Perhaps it would be best if you imagined it as your own fancy bids, assuming it will rise to the occasion, for certainly I cannot suit you all. But the success of this fairy tale city depends on one child living in a dungeon in perpetual filth, darkness, and misery. And when each citizen of Omelas is of age, they have to see this child, but show it no love, and consent to its continued life of misery for the sake of the happiness of the rest of the city. Le Guin's story ends by describing those who forsake the city when they see the child. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot describe it at all. It is possible that it does not exist, but they seem to know where they are going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. And while Le Guin's short story is a powerful attack on the problems of utilitarianism, it is not an attack Mill would agree with, as his two most famous works, Utilitarianism and On Liberty, are an attempt together to show that the first principle of utility is the protection of the rights of all.
Hello, magandang araw sa inyong lahat. Sa aking panimula, nais ko munang ipakilala sa inyo ang aking mga kagrupo. Unang-una ang aming leader na si Thompson Gabriel Teodoro. Pangalawa, si Mika Faith Gecomo. Pangatlo, si Nicole Hannah Candas. At pang-apat ay ako, Marifer Gabule. Una, mag-proceed muna tayo sa aming objectives. Ang nilalaman ng objectives namin ay first, to have knowledge about utilitarianism. Pangalawa, knowing and have information about John Stuart Mill. Third, last, to clarify the two types of utilitarianism. So, ano nga ba ang utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is a doctrine that the useful is the good and that the determining consideration of right conduct should be the usefulness of its consequences. Specifically, a theory that the aim of action should be the largest possible balance of pleasure over pain, or the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So, utilitarianism is a species of consequentialism. Ito yung consequentialism. Ito yung nagsasabi o naghahatol kung tama o hindi ang isang bagay sa pamamagitan kung ano ang kahihinatnan nito. The general doctrine in ethics that action or types of action should be evaluated on the basis of their consequences. Utilitarianism and other consequentialist theories are in opposition to egoism. Egoism, ito naman yung pansariling interest. o maaari ring pansariling kaligayahan o kaligayahang pansarili. And also, the view that each person should pursue his or her own self-interest, gaya nga nasabi ko kanina, even at the expense of others, and to any ethical theory that regards some actions or types of action as right or wrong independently of their consequences.
Now let's proceed on uncovering the life of John Stuart Mill. This will help us have a better understanding on his takes and why it became a relevant part of utilitarianism. Mill has been proclaimed as one of the most influential English-speaking philosopher in the 19th century. He is a philosopher, a political economist who later became part of the parliament, the legislative part of the government, which this is the part where that creates the law and that works with the judicial and executive branch. He is known there for advocating liberty, women's right, and individualism. Naniniwala siya na dapat malaya ang mga tao mula sa kahit anumang operasyon o pamimilit ng mga nakaupo o nakaluklok sa pwesto. Na dapat ang mga tao ay may namumuhay sa paraan ng gusto nila, may preferred way of living sila, and malaya silang makapili ng kanilang sariling political stances. Pinaglalaban niya din ang individualismo kung saan naniniwala siya na ang society at mga tao ay mas lalong makikinabang kapag ang mga tao ay vocal sa mga gusto nila. And sinasabi dito na sinasabi niya na ang pagkakaroon ng sariling choice o decision ay makakatulong sa mga tao sa pag-grow nila bilang isang good chooser na kapag may choice sila lagi, malalaman nila yung mga pagkakamali nila at doon matututo hanggang sa maging isang wais na o tinatawag niya good chooser ang mga tao. He was born in Pentonville, London, United Kingdom on 1806, and he was educated by his father, who is a Scottish philosopher, economist, and historian named James Mill, with his friend who is a really notable scholar too, Jeremy Bentham. They were really strict about his academic activities. At the age of 3, he already learned Greek and Latin at the age of 8. And it is also reported that at the age of 12, he already learned almost a lot of classical canon. Bentham and James Mill were really trying their hard to make him a genius so he can continue the legacy of utilitarianism. He started working on 1823 at East India Company. He was 17 that time and only retired after years on 1858 after the company was abolished. John Stuart Mill married Harriet Taylor in 1851. They first met at work and they shared 21 years of friendship and romance and idealism. It is said that John Stuart Mill considered Harriet as one of the most intelligent people that he met. He considered her as the good influencer, and he even credited her with some of his work. They also first wrote or co-authored together the first serious case about political and philosophical domestic violence. Some claims that Taylor is the one who shaped Mill's advocacy about women's rights. Unfortunately, Harriet Taylor died on 1858 And the following year, John Stuart Mills published On Liberty on 1859, where he explored the limits of society over an individual's right or life. On that book, he mentioned tyranny majority. Dito, sinasabi niya na may mga taong napipilitan na sumabay sa norms at it is considered, sinasabi niya, it is considered as oppression kasi napipilitan lang tayo at nawawalan tayo ng sariling choice. At yun yung nagre-restrict sa atin sa pamumuhay ng malaya at sa pag-achieve ng happiness. Then in 1861, he published the Consideration of Representative Government, Utilitarianism in 1863, and lastly, the Subjection of Woman in 1869. For 3 years being member of the parliament, being a reformer there, which is someone who promotes change for improvement. There he advocated for voters' right, equality for women, and stop government paternalism. Government paternalism is when the government chooses for the whole. Yung silang nagde-decision kung ano nga ba ang kinabubuti ng lahat ng karamihan, the majority. And sinasabi ni Mills na hindi ito maganda kasi threat siya sa right ng isang individual.
Let's proceed to why did John Stuart Mill wrote or rewrite the utilitarianism that was originated by Jeremy Bentham. Bakit nga ba? Kasi gusto ni John Stuart Mill na i-expand or i-defend yung theory ni Bentham. Kasi John Stuart Mill thought that yung mga tao, binabasa nila yung teorya about sa utility ni Bentham's. Pero hindi naman talaga nila totally ito naintindihan. Kaya sinulat niya yung utilitarianism para depensahan ito at palawakin pa. And Mill went to acknowledge another criticism of Bentham's utilitarianism. May pinuna si John Stuart Mill sa teorya ni Bentham's. People are inherently selfish. Yung mga tao likas talaga makasarili. So it is practically impossible to act a utilitarian manner, which demands that people be selfless. Mill wrote that most people do not always need to think about the happiness. Kaya sumulat si Mill na karamihan ng mga tao hindi palaging kailang isipin ng tungkol sa kaligayahan ng buong populasyon ng mundo kapag kumilos sila. But they should take into consideration how their actions could affect those around them. Dapat nilang isaalang-ala kung paano makakaapekto ang kanilang mga aksyon sa mga nakapaligid sa kanila.
So, utilitarianism, according to John Stuart Mill, is based on the greatest happiness principle, which he states that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So, ganito yon, kapag yung decision o yung action na ginawa ng isang tao ay nag-cause ng happiness sa karamihan, ng happiness o pleasure sa karamihan, then ito yung morally right. Pero kung ito naman ay nag-produce lang ng reverse happiness or ng negative or ng reverse happiness sa karamihan, then ito yung morally wrong. So, yung action mismo, it doesn't really matter sa utilitarianism. Ang tinitingnan doon or ginajudge para malaman kung ano, kung paano malaman or matukoy ang action kung morally right or wrong, ay nakafocus sila doon sa resulta, sa happiness ng majority. So, ang happiness sa viewpoint ng utilitarianism ni John Stuart Mills ay nakafocus sa predominance ng pleasure over pain. Later on, rinevise niya to at tinukoy ang mga qualities at quantities ng pleasure. Ang highest form of pleasure daw sa kanya ay ang intellectual pleasure, kung saan anything intellectually stimulating, ito ay nagkakos ng pleasure sa atin. Example nito ay yung mga bagay or pangyayari na nagtitrigger sa atin na mag-improve or gumawa ng action na magkakos ng change, tulad ng pagbabasa, nag-aaral tayo para matuto, at iba pa. Yung lowest form naman ng happiness according sa kanya ay yung physical or sense pleasure. Ito yung sex, pag-inom ng alak or pagkain, anything na physically mo ma-achieve. So, tatandaan na ang utilitarianism ay nakafocus sa consequences or sa result ng action. Ginajudge yung action based sa quality, sa quantity ng happiness or pleasure na pinoproduce nito. It doesn't really matter or hindi masyadong tinitingnan yung intention o yung iba pang bagay. Basta nakafocus siya sa consequences at sa resulta ng action na ginawa mo, na kung gaano karami or kakataas yung happiness na na-produce nito. Dahil ang morality na according sa utilitarianism ay nakafocus sa consequences ng action mo. Sa utilitarianism, importante yung opinion ng community mo sa action na ginawa mo. Ang community ang makakapagsabi kung yung ginawa mo ay morally right or wrong. Kung yung action mo ba ay nag-produce ng happiness and pleasure sa karamihan or nag-produce ng negativity or nag-reverse nito yung happiness ng community. Doon dapat i-considered mo talaga yung majority sa action mo kung gusto mo ma-identify na morally right yung ginawa mo. Para mas maintindihan pa natin yung utilitarianism sa viewpoint ni J.J. Stuart Mills, let's move on sa example na mag-explore pa sa opinion niya about sa happiness, pleasure, and morality. So, example dito is, James has recently got fired from his job. His wife, Jamie, needs $300 for her surgery and another $100 for their kids' tuition fee. No one wanted to lend them money, even their millionaire friend, Isaac. Out of desperation, he stole $350 from Isaac. So, kung i-judge to sa viewpoint ng utilitarianism, nag-cause ba ng happiness and pleasure yung ginawa ni James? Yes, because sa ninakaw niyang pera na $350, napagamot niya na yung kanyang asawa, gumaling, nag-is na yung pain ng asawa niya, at nakapagbayad ng tuition yung anak niya. So, hindi sila na-kick out sa school. So, ibig sabihin na to na nag-produce siya ng happiness sa karamihan. At hindi naman din nag-produce ng pain to kay Isaac kasi milyonaryo naman siya. Barya lang sa kanya yung $350 na yon. So, ang ginawa ni James ay morally right according sa paniniwala ng utilitarianism. Pero kung titingnan mo to sa ibang viewpoint talaga, makakonsider siya na mali kasi ang pagnanakaw ay kino-consider nating mga tao as morally wrong in all kind of ways. Kasi pagnanakaw ay pagkuha ng hindi naman ng gamit na or bagay na hindi naman sa'yo. Example 2 naman ay, a group of friends planned to hang out. 2 out of 5 of them wanted sweets, but the 3 of them are suffering from diabetes. So the 2 of them convinced that it is alright to have a vegetable or another healthy meal for the sake of achieving the majority's happiness. So 5 sila, 'di ba? Ang 2 sa kanila yung gusto kumain ng something sweet kasi nagki-crave, at 3 naman sa kanila ay may diabetes, bawal kumain ng ganon. Para ma-achieve yung happiness ng majority sa 5, ang ginawa nila ay mas sinundan nila yung gusto nung 3 ay nung 3 dahil ito yung makakapagpasaya sa iba. So, sa viewpoint ng utilitarianism, ito ay morally right, especially kasi na-consider yung happiness and pleasure ng majority. So, let me just remind you again that actions can be judged whether it is right or wrong in utilitarianism by looking at the amount of happiness and pleasure that this produce to the majority. Let's always remember that happiness based on utilitarianism is the amount of pleasure that is present on the action or the consequences or result, and happiness is when there is more pain than when there is more pain that is present on the action, and when the pleasure is nowhere to be found. So for the conclusion, what makes action right or wrong based on utilitarianism is about the effect of it to the community, to the majority, instead of focusing on the motive or intention of the said action. And Mill said that in utilitarianism, they can consider not following some moral rules if it will cause a greater amount of happiness. He said that there are situations that that can be exempted on the rules to be and it will still be considered morally right, because they really emphasize that greatest happiness is more important than the individual's right. Any action can be morally justified, anything, basta it will lead to the greatest happiness of majority, na kahit yung pagkamatay ng karamihan ay magkakos naman sa pagkabuhay at happiness ng mas marami pang tao. Then naniniwala ang utilitarianism na ito ay pwede pa rin ma-justify as morally right.
Bentham and Mill's utilitarianism stated that people should act in a way where the most beneficial for their community, country, and etc. Ang teorya ng utilitarianism ay mabuti, lohikal at pare-pareho. Ang etikang utilitarian ay sumusunod sa batas ng pinakamalaking kaligayahan. Kumbaga, focus lang talaga nito is yung happiness. Happiness ng isang tao o ng individual. Ayon sa batas na ito, hinahangad ng mga tao na bawasan ang pagdurusa at i-maximize ang kaligayahan. Sa makatuwid, ang isang aksyon na tama sa moral ay dapat humantong sa pinakamalaking posibleng kasiyahan. Pinapahiwatig din nito na ang aksyon ay nagdudulot ng sakit sa mga tao ay mali sa moral. Kaya, ang teoryang ito ay hindi masisisi. Bakit? Dahil ito ay tumutugon sa lahat ng posibleng pagtutol. Salamat.